and North Africa for centuries. This area was stable and apparently prosperous, with little or no trace of desolation. Roman peace does appear to have been a reality, for rebellions and large-scale violence were extremely rare. Even critics of empires must concede this about Rome. By any standards, the Roman Empire was unusual, and this, apart from its continuing fascination and appearance in current debates, makes it all the more important to understand what Roman peace really meant. It matters if it was solely the product of bluntly wielded military power and oppression, or of subtler, more insidious methods of coercion. As important is some understanding of the cost of imperial rule to the subject population, and how these felt about being part of a foreign empire. A significant proportion of the world's inhabitants lived in the Roman Empire, and that in itself is a good reason to wish to understand what this meant. It is well worth asking how complete and secure the Pax Romana actually was, but from the start we ought to think a little about just what peace means. I was born in peacetime, the child of parents who had lived through the Second World War. My mother was a small child during the Blitz in Cardiff, and still remembers the air raid siren wailing, the fear of going into the dark and cold air raid shelter in their garden, the different sounds of bombs, landmines, and anti-aircraft guns, the patter of falling shrapnel, the stench after a raid, and the houses reduced to rubble, sometimes with people buried underneath. She also speaks about she and her friends staging concerts and collecting pennies to buy a Spitfire, of uniforms everywhere, and of being unable to cross the street because of the stream of trucks carrying GIs and supplies on their way to the docks to embark for Normandy. The memories are still vivid today, and very immediate whenever she talks about those years. My father was an apprentice in the Merchant Navy, did the Atlantic run, and then was in the Mediterranean supporting the landings in Tunisia and Italy. His ship was in the Bay of Naples when Vesuvius erupted in 1944, and he remembered having to clean ash off the deck. Only occasionally would he speak of the constant threat of U-boats and air attack, of ammunition ships exploding and the sea on fire from burning fuel, with men trying to swim to safety through it. He left the Merchant Navy and was soon old enough to be conscripted into the army, and served in Palestine under the British Mandate, caught between Jewish and Arab militants and a target for both. His father had served through the First World War on the Western Front, at Gallipoli, and in Egypt and Palestine. Neither were professionals. They had done their bit, like millions of their contemporaries, and then happily returned to civilian life. The 70th anniversaries of VE and VJ days were commemorated in 2015 while I was writing this book, alongside centenaries of events in the First World War, but it still seems natural to speak of 1939 to 1945 as the war, a habit I picked up from my parents and their contemporaries. My brother and I are among the last to be born, for whom active memory of the Second World War was just one generation away. This was not uncommon at our school, where the parents were a little older than the national average, and there were a fair few boys whose fathers had been in the forces, and at least one Bevan boy sent to a coal mine. The war still seemed very immediate, and most boys of our age were more or less obsessed with it. There were new dramas being broadcast, and by this time the great flurry of war films produced in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s were old enough to appear regularly on television. We watched these avidly, read books and comics about it, assembled plastic model kits of fighters, bombers, tanks, and warships, and brandished toy guns in imaginary battles, where one side was usually the Germans or Japanese, doing our best to mimic the sounds of machine guns and explosions. Sometimes our games instead took us to the Wild West or outer space, both staples of television in the 1970s. But more than anything else, we relived the Second World War. It was a good war against bad enemies, and we won, led by familiar actors on screen, the heroes of our comics.